The next killer is the artist, and her story I personally think is one of the saddest ones. So she was called Carmina, and not long after she was born, her mother left, and her father resented her for that. And he turned to drinking and, just basically nothing else, just drinking to take that pain away. So Carmina kind of took on the guilt of that. She also had a young brother called Matthias, and she loved him. And she kind of took on the parent role. She would take care of him, she would take care of her father. She was basically doing everything a child her age shouldn't have to do. Carmina was also very gifted as an artist, and one day she was in the house painting, and Matthias was outside playing, and she figured, obviously, he wasn't much help, but her father was another set of eyes and a brother. And then she noticed after a while that she couldn't hear him anymore, even though she thought he was very close. She couldn't hear him playing, and that worried her. So she went out, and it turned out he had gone down to the river, and sadly he'd fallen in, and she was beside herself. She was so upset, and again her father blamed her for what happened to Matthias. So she had the guilt of her mother leaving and her brother passing away, eating away at her, and she lost passion for anything. She didn't paint anymore. She just stayed in the house looking after her father, and that was her life. And it got too much one day, and she actually went to a well-known bridge nearby where a lot of people would jump, and she prepared herself to do the same so she could be with her brother. And she jumped, and she closed her eyes and waited, but the impact never came. And she opened her eyes to see that she'd been surrounded by crows, and they had lifted her and stopped her from falling, and they were taking her upwards again, and she ended up safely back on the bridge, and they flew away. But something told her that they weren't that far away, and it kind of reignited her passion for her artwork again. She would draw what she felt would symbolise how she felt that day, and then the crow saving her. And her artwork could sometimes be beautiful, it would sometimes be dark, but it attracted a lot of attention, and she became very well known. And then one day it attracted the attention of someone called the Back Label, and they were well known for being a bit dodgy, and they tried to recruit Carmina to be with them. And she investigated them and discovered what they were doing, and she realised that they weren't as innocent as they made out, so she refused. And for a little while she didn't hear anything. But because her work was gaining attention, she started doing poetry and things like that, and she was starting to get a lot of negative attention as well as positive. And it got to a point where she was receiving death threats. So she went and lived back with her father to hide away. And that seemed to work for a while. And then one night, someone hit her over the head, and she was unconscious. And then when she woke up, she felt sand stinging her skin. And she was taken to a remote place, and men in robes were stood all around. And she knew then it was the Vat Clable taking their vengeance for her saying no. And one of them came up and they started reciting something in the language she didn't understand. And then they brought the blade down and they took hands. And the leader of the Vat Clable walked up and he said, "How are you going to draw now?" And then next someone came and they took a tongue and he said, "How are you going to recite your poems now?" And he was just about to land the final blow, and the crows came back and they stopped him, and Carmina was thankful that they come back and they essentially saved her life. And then it quickly turned to her being distraught because the crows next went to all of her friends who had been kidnapped alongside her and unalived them. And there was nothing she could do. She couldn't speak, she couldn't shoo them away or anything. And it was then she passed away with the knowledge that she lost her brother. She'd lost any way to paint, any way to do poetry. Her artistry had been the way that she'd been able to cope, and she couldn't do that anymore. And then she'd been unable to prevent the same thing from happening to her friends. So that was the last thing she remembered as she passed away. And as she left this world, that was when the fog started to descend. Now, in the world of DBD, the artist, I think she's a great killer to go up against. She has it reminds me kind of like a horror movie, the chase music, but at the same time, she's very good to play as well. She has some very good powers, and the crows play a big part in her powers and the way she downs the survivors. So she's very good in both aspects. Next is a killer that is, in my opinion, one of the most scary. Their gameplay in the DBD world is terrifying. They have powers that surround the world in darkness, so you don't know where you're going, but they can still see your aura even as you're running, so you don't know where they are, but they know where you are. And they are very difficult to play against as well. So no one really has a concrete way of explaining what the dredge is. It's not even. It's very hard to explain, but it started with a man called Otto, and Otto was in charge of a village where everything was happy, and he shared his secrets of apologies for the pause and meltdown. So he kind of shared his secret of meditation and good thoughts amongst the villagers, so that there was a community of no dark thoughts, no dark feelings. Everything was positive and there was only good energy. But it started to get to the point where it was more controlled by him. he would banish anyone who shared negative thoughts, and they would never be seen again. And it was still a village where everything was positive, but people started to fear that they will be cast away for the wrong thoughts. So a lot of the time the villagers would congregate and they would sing, they would perform hymns and spells to make sure that everything would stay positive and no one would be banished. But it caused a bit of an uprising of people worrying, and word got back to Otto, and he gathered everybody in front of a stage, and there was a sickly, malnourished woman in the middle of the stage screaming and begging to be set free. And he said this woman they caught was actually a journalist that was reporting back everything that she found about the village. And she steps forward and told everyone, this person, Otto, that they were basically worshipping as this amazing person, was actually using everybody, and he was torturing the people that he banished. That's why no one ever saw them again. He would torture them in terrible ways and unalive them. And then he got her and unalived her before she got to the others too much. And because of what they saw, people started having more and more of these negative thoughts. So they were huddling together, hymns again, anything they could think to make it better. And that's when there was a creaking sound and the stage fell through. And when the dust cleared, Otto saw a terrifying creature, which had been what would have got everyone if they thought of negative things. It brought darkness with it, and it turned to Otto, and there was this kind of, it's hard to explain, but I understood him, and in a way he understood it as well. And it just turned and it went away into the darkness. So the positivity that they've been so keen to keep had been broken forever, and this creature was out there in the world somewhere, and no one knew how to find it and how to stop it. But that's how it came to be in the Dead by Daylight world. Next is the Knight. In the game, he's quite a good killer and very difficult to go against. It's very hard to hide from him, and he uses his powers to bring forth somebody else to guard an area and to, find anyone who's inside of the area. So he was called, it's either Tahos or Tahos, and it's a bit hard to get into his entire lore because it's very long and complicated, but his childhood was very, he found it very hard to forget, and what he did remember was his mother force feeding him a black substance, and he woke up and he was in a mass grave, and he crawled out of the mass grave only to pass, and then he awoke again, and he had he was taken somewhere to learn how to be a knight, to forge weapons, to fight with them, to do basically everything he had to do. He had friends and followers, and they were two in particular they became very close to, and they almost became followers. And it was through the fog that the darkness, through the darkness that the fog overtook him and brought him to where he is now. Next is Skull Merchant, and Skull Merchant is a very good killer, and she's hard to play against as well. She's got a very good lunge attack, and she uses drones to follow survivors and find where they are. So she was called Adriana, and she came from Brazil, and her father designed mangas. Well, he designed just pictures at first, and then he met Adriana's mother through designing her a logo for a company, and that was how Adriana was born. And Adriana growing up was very competitive. She was a very clever student. She never failed at anything. She always seemed to succeed, but at the same time, because she was so incredibly competitive, she could be violent, which got her in a lot of trouble. So it's a bit of both. Around that time, her father started to design manga, and he started looking into getting it published so that they could afford private school fees for Adriana, who was still excelling. And it was around about a few years later when her father's manga started to lose popularity, and it was dropped by the publisher. And it had an effect on Adriana at school as well, and she was no longer seen as the head student, and someone else kind of took over that role, which really got to her, to the point where she would take inspiration from some of her father's darkest mangas. There was a character that would stalk people and find out about them and then close in for kill. And that's what she did to this student. She would stalk them, she would find out about them, and she would plan all these terrible things. But she lacked the conviction to actually do it, so nothing ever came of it. And then her father he spent less time with his daughter. He was absent a lot of her life, and his mangas, because of his feelings, started to get even darker. And it was a similar character that would stalk people with drones, but she would have claws, and she would, dismember people. And Adriana eventually started to take inspiration for that character and keep herself competitive and aggressive, and because they no longer had the funds from her father's publishing, Adriana kind of took over in the way of getting jobs to help her mother. So she would work in estate agents and things, and her competition, she would just dispose of them, and unaliving people didn't bother her anymore. And her final target was a company owner. They did something called survival tours, which was basically what it said on the tin. You had to survive in extreme conditions in the wilderness and things, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to Adriana. So she used drones to stalk him, and then she used the claws, and she did everything that the person in the manga did. And then one day, her father just left and left behind a series of illustrations from a manga he called The School Merchant, and that became the last straw for Adriana. She completely became that person, and that is what caused her to become who she did.